Okay, the third part of checking out my history is a shorter video than usual because checking out my history itself is quite a simplistic poem. Once you've got that idea of the idiolect, the Creole, you've got the idea behind the poem of the blinding to his identity, and you've got that idea of the juxtaposition between the ridiculous and the serious, and you've got that tone, you've got the difference between the structure of the longer lines and the shorter lines. You've pretty much got the main ideas. So what's crucial for checking out my history is to think about a couple of poems that might link really, really well. And I've come up with a couple of examples just to quickly work through now. Remember, there's all sorts of different ways to compare them. And to plan a comparison. Tables work really, really well. Venn diagrams can work well if you can work mathematically like that. My favourite is the double bubble, where you've got bubbles linking off, and the David Hiley map there. All of which are available on the O Drive to those working in my school. We'll work through some other examples at some point with double bubbles. But let's imagine a question comparing poems where power is imposed on others by the state, by an authority, by the government. And so we might in that case link to London by William Blake. And of course London is all about the late 18th century poverty that existed in London because of the state keeping the poor in their place. Just as John Agard in checking out the history, living in Guyana, had an education system imposed on him by a distant British government and their white Eurocentric ways. So here's some ways that you could link them. What I've done for both questions really is thought about links in blue and comparisons and contrasts in red. Okay, so first of all, for both, we've got that sense of anger. Now, how does John Agard represent that sense of anger? Well, we've got the repetition, dem tell me, as if there's real anger directed at the British government. And because of that cyclical structure, which we come back to at the end, that anger keeps coming back. The government continue to impose that education system upon the Caribbean and Guyana and John Agard's own experience, but it's that idea that this has made him unaware of his own cultural heritage. So there's that real anger that comes through that repetition. What Dem want to tell me, it's taken away from his hands and countless others like him. The power is all with the British government in a distant land. In London, that sense of anger comes through all the way through the poem. I wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames did flow. So you've got the sense of the repetition of chartered. This is something that is planned by the government, imposed. Even nature is being controlled by the government. But there's so many angry images that come through. The mind-forged manacles, the marriage hearse, the blood that runs down palace walls. All of those show Blake's inherent anger with the system, with the government, with the state of poverty that exists in London in the late 18th century. So we've also got, and I've given some examples through there, that all of that comes through the repetition. We've got the repetition of dem tell me, dem tell me. We've got the repetition in London of the chartered streets, but also the marks of weakness, marks of woe. And we might link those marks, that permanent idea that the poor are forever marked with their poverty, to this verb later in checking out history, carving out my own history. He wants to make it permanent, his own heritage. So really crucial key verb there. Now, what's slightly different about the two poems, we've just talked about carving. John Agard at the end, in the conclusion of his poem, comes up with a solution. He's taken it upon himself to learn about his culture. By the end of London, there is no sense of solution. All we get is blights with plagues, the marriage hearse, that all things will end in death, will end in misery. Even the comparative joy of marriage is short-lived. So he's offering no solution. There is no solution to that endless cycle of poverty, although we know that William Blake was inspired by the French Revolution. So perhaps somewhere else in Blake's poetry is the idea of revolution, but there's no solution offered in the poem London. So we've got a really nice sense of comparison there. Let's think about a different way that we could compare, because we might get a question on identity. It's one of the very key themes that comes up again and again and again when you look at different poems. All sorts of poems are about identity. Checking Out My History, Emigre, Tissue are probably the three most obvious ones. And I think John Agard's poem goes really nicely with Emigre. Let's think of a few ways that we can look at this. First of all, we've got the sinister idea of the third person. In John Agard, in Checking Out Your History, he talks about Dem Tell Me, the third person imposed power of the British government. Dem. You might talk about the Creole and him claiming back his identity even through that third person pronoun. It's much more sinister again in Emigre. They mutter death. They circle me. Towards the end of the third stanza in Emigre, we've got a repetition of this mysterious third person pronoun to suggest the struggles and fear of the emigre living in the new city, a place where it's supposed to be free, a place where it's supposed to be friendly, but these unnamed individuals who actually mutter death, who circle her, who cause her fear. Really nice grammatical link between the two poems. Both of them offer a sense of separation. They don't feel natural in their homes. In John Agard, in Checking Out Your History, he doesn't feel comfortable with the imposed education system. And you can see that through the speed of the lines when he talks about Toussaint Louverture, when he talks about Nanny de Maroon, when he talks about Mary Seacole. He does that through the figurative language, the yellow sunrise, the bright healing star of Mary Seacole there, and the shortness of lines give his passion for where he feels otherwise detached from the education system. That sense of separation in Emigre comes through all the way, because she looks back on her own home with a sense of sunlight, and it's sunlight that appears at the end and repeated at the end of all stanzas. But also, there once was a country, I left it as a child. That ellipsis there is that degree of separation, that pause for thought while she thinks back to another country where she felt more at home. So she feels separated in her new home, and that comes through time and time and time again. We've got the passion and joy for the identity with which they feel most associated with. In Checking Out My History, John Agard, again, I've just talked about it there, the passion. He'd lick back Napoleon, Nanny, Seafar Woman of Mountain Dream. So we've got that passion that comes through the figurative language and the shorter lines of John Agard's heritage. For Emigre, we've got the sense of the bright filled paperweight, that souvenir, that memento that is carried with the emigre from one culture to another, to keep a hold of the joyous images that she had as a child back in the country that is now sick with war. And we've got a sense of permanence in both poems. And again, this comes back to the idea of carving out my own identity. It's important for John Agard to feel that his identity becomes permanent to him. So that quite violent verb is used, that he has to force his way past the British authorities to earn his own identity. In Emigre, the end is my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So it's that permanence of sunlight that appears all the way through the poem, gives a sense that that identity, no matter how far it's been repressed through having to emigrate, it's actually always within her. And that shadow falling, although there's darkness in her life, although there's troubled times, it's evidence that deep within her, she has passion for her own culture, for that sunlight that still exists within her. The difference really is the tone. In Checking Out My History, John Agard uses an almost ridiculing tone. 1066 and all that, Dick Whittington and his cat, the man who invented the balloon. They're all quite ludicrous examples of things that we learn in an English Eurocentric view of the world. And he contrasts that again with the passion for his own culture. And that sense of joy comes through the poem, the joy of finding his own identity, and the daftness almost of imposing someone else's culture onto someone. That sense of joy, that sense of ridicule is very different to the fearful tone at the third stanza in Emigre. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls, and immediately we've got that juxtaposition between the tone of reflection and nostalgia of her old city, but the city of walls, that feeling of entrapment and fear that surrounds her in her new city. And we talked about the paperweight, we've talked about the sunlight, the image of dancing. All of that joy and nostalgia and brightness comes through in a sense of joy, reflection, of wonder, of memory, which juxtaposes clearly. So you've got two very, very different tones in both, a juxtaposition of tones, but the tones are very different. It allows you a different way into looking at the poems by empathising with the feelings that go through the poems as well.